Every time your child refuses dinner, you think you're helping by negotiating, encouraging, or making something else. But what if those loving reactions are quietly teaching them not to eat, and the real reason has nothing to do with willpower or behavior at all? At some point, I realized something that felt deeply uncomfortable to admit. Every time my child refused dinner, I thought I was responding with love, with patience, with good intentions. But what if the very things I believed were helping were quietly doing the opposite? It usually started the same way. Early evening, the house finally slowing down after a long day, dinner on the table, and then that single sentence that could instantly change the mood of the entire room. I don't like this. In that moment, I didn't pause to think. I reacted. I begged. I negotiated. I promised dessert. And on nights when I didn't have the energy to fight, I made something else. Something easy. Something familiar. Something I knew would disappear from the plate without tears. And yet, as I stood there making a second meal, there was always that feeling. Not just exhaustion, but something heavier. A quiet sense that I was losing a battle I didn't even understand. I wasn't angry at my child. I was confused. How could something as basic as eating feel so hard when I cared this much? For a long time, I told myself the same story most parents do. My child was just picky, strong-willed, going through a phase. Or maybe I wasn't being firm enough. Maybe I needed better rules, better strategies, more discipline at the table. But one night, standing in the kitchen, I had a thought that stopped me cold. What if my child wasn't refusing food because they were difficult? What if they were refusing because of what they were learning from me? That question was unsettling because it didn't accuse my child. It pointed straight back at the system I had created without realizing it. The routines, the reactions, the patterns repeated night after night, all driven by love, worry, and the fear of hunger. I started paying closer attention, not just to what my child ate, but to what happened before dinner, to how often snacks appeared, to the way my voice changed when I felt anxious, to how quickly I tried to fix discomfort instead of sitting with it. And slowly, a different picture began to form. What if picky eating wasn't really about food at all? What if it was about control, biology, and timing? What if children don't need to be taught to eat through pressure, persuasion, or rewards, but need the right conditions for their bodies to want to eat in the first place? Once that idea took hold, I couldn't unsee it. The more I tried to control eating, the more resistance I got. The more I rescued, the less motivation appeared. And the harder I worked, the worse it seemed to become. That's when I realized something important. I wasn't failing as a parent. I was just working with the wrong understanding. And once I started asking different questions, everything about mealtimes began to look different. This isn't a story about strict rules or forcing children to eat. It's about what happens when we stop fighting biology and psychology and start working with them instead. Once I started questioning the system around our meals instead of my child's behavior, a harder realization followed. Many of the things I did out of love were quietly teaching lessons I never intended to teach. The first lesson was hidden inside the backup meal. Every time dinner was refused and I stepped back into the kitchen to make something else, I told myself a comforting story. At least they'll eat. At least they won't go to bed hungry. It felt responsible. It felt caring. But children don't absorb our intentions. They absorb patterns. And the pattern was simple and powerful. Refusal leads to a better outcome. I wasn't witnessing stubbornness. I was watching learning in real time. My child wasn't testing me out of defiance. They were responding to a system that rewarded rejection. Once that connection clicked, it became impossible to ignore how often I had unintentionally rehearsed that lesson, night after night. The second lesson was taught through pressure. Just one more bite. You haven't eaten enough. Try it for me. I believe these words were gentle, supportive even. But pressure, no matter how softly delivered, carries a message that children feel instantly. Something about this isn't your choice anymore. And when a child senses that their autonomy is being taken away, their body responds before their mind does. I noticed it in the smallest ways. A stiffening of the shoulders, a turning away of the head, the sudden loss of appetite the moment I started counting bites. What looked like defiance was actually self-protection. The more I leaned in, the more my child leaned out. It was unsettling to realize that my presence at the table, meant to encourage, was sometimes the very thing shutting the process down. Eating had stopped being about hunger or curiosity. It had become a power struggle neither of us wanted, but both of us were trapped inside. The third lesson was the most invisible one because it happened long before dinner ever began. The snacks in the late afternoon, the crackers offered to keep the peace, the juice box handed over during errands. None of these moments felt significant on their own, but together they erased the one biological signal that makes eating possible: appetite. I had been taught, like many parents, to treat hunger as something dangerous, something to prevent at all costs. And without realizing it, I had created a constant stream of small foods that kept my child comfortably full, but never truly hungry. By the time dinner arrived, there was no internal motivation left, no reason for the body to engage with unfamiliar foods. Refusal wasn't rebellion. It was a logical response from a body that simply wasn't asking for fuel. What struck me most was how interconnected these three mistakes were. Backup meals removed consequences. Pressure removed autonomy. Grazing removed hunger. Together they formed a system where refusing food made perfect sense. And here's the part that mattered most to me. None of this meant I was doing something wrong because I didn't care enough. I was doing it because I cared deeply. I just didn't understand the mechanics underneath my actions. Once I saw that, blame became useless. Toward my child and toward myself. The question wasn't how to get my child to cooperate. It was how to redesign the environment so cooperation wasn't required at all. That realization opened the door to a much deeper understanding of what children are actually responding to when they push food away. And to get there, I had to stop looking at behavior and start looking at biology. Once I stopped blaming behavior and started examining the system, the next question became unavoidable. What is actually happening inside a child when they sit down at the table and push food away? The first answer surprised me because it had nothing to do with attitude or manners. It was biology. Children are born with something called neophobia, a natural fear of new foods. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. For most of human history, unfamiliar food could be dangerous. A cautious brain kept a small body alive. When I looked at picky eating through that lens, it stopped feeling personal. My child wasn't rejecting my cooking. Their brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do: approach the unfamiliar slowly. What struck me was how often we interpret that hesitation as defiance instead of protection. We see refusal and assume stubbornness, when in reality, the nervous system is asking for safety and repetition. The problem isn't that children fear new foods. The problem is that we expect them not to. The second layer went even deeper, and it forced me to look at my own role more honestly. Humans, regardless of age, have a deep need for autonomy. We want to feel that our bodies belong to us. When eating becomes something that is monitored, evaluated, or directed by someone else, the brain doesn't experience it as care. It experiences it as control. I noticed how quickly my child's body reacted when I leaned in too close. Appetite vanished. Curiosity shut down. Even gentle encouragement seemed to trigger resistance. That's because the nervous system can't distinguish between force and pressure. Once autonomy feels threatened, the body's job is no longer to eat, it's to defend. This helped me understand why so many well-intentioned feeding strategies fail. Sticker charts, praise, rewards, even calm persuasion all share one hidden message: someone else is in charge of your appetite. And the moment that message lands, the child's body does the only thing it can do to regain control. It says no. The third piece tied everything together, and it was the one I had been missing entirely. Appetite isn't a personality trait. It's a biological rhythm. Hunger rises and falls in predictable cycles, but only if we allow it to. When food is constantly available, that rhythm never fully develops. The body never gets the chance to say, "Now I need fuel." I started paying attention to my own experiences as an adult. When I ate out of boredom or stress, food felt dull. When I ate because I was genuinely hungry, even simple meals were satisfying. Children are no different. They just have fewer words to explain it. What changed my perspective was realizing that many children rarely arrive at the table in a state of true appetite. Snacks, drinks, and small bites throughout the day keep the body hovering in a neutral zone. Not starving, but not hungry either. In that state, unfamiliar food feels unnecessary. Refusal becomes logical. This wasn't about letting children suffer. It wasn't about toughness. It was about understanding that mild, predictable hunger is not a problem to solve. It's a signal the body needs in order to engage with food. When I put these three pieces together, everything aligned. Fear of the unfamiliar, loss of autonomy, and disrupted appetite weren't separate issues. They were interacting forces, and the more we tried to override them with pressure or persuasion, the stronger they became. For the first time, picky eating stopped feeling like a battle of wills. It started to look like a mismatch between how children are wired and how we've structured their eating environment. And once I saw that clearly, the idea of fixing behavior felt misguided. What needed to change wasn't the child, it was the conditions surrounding them. Once it became clear that my child's resistance wasn't something to overcome, but something to understand, I started looking for a structure that worked with those biological and psychological realities instead of fighting them. That search led me to a way of thinking about meals that felt almost unsettling at first because of how simple it was. In many French families, dinner follows one basic rule: one family, one meal. There is no second menu waiting in the wings. No negotiations about alternatives. The parent decides what is served, when it is served, and where it is eaten. The child decides whether to eat and how much. When I first heard this, my instinctive reaction was discomfort. It sounded rigid, harsh even. I worried it would feel controlling or dismissive of a child's preferences. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized I had misunderstood where the control actually lived. This approach isn't about forcing children to eat what they don't want. It's about clearly defining responsibilities. The adult takes ownership of the structure. The child keeps ownership of their body. No one crosses into the other's role. And that clarity turns out to be deeply calming. What struck me most was how much pressure disappeared the moment I stopped trying to manage intake. I wasn't watching every bite. I wasn't measuring success by how much ended up in my child's stomach. My job was done once the meal was served. What happened next belonged to them. The second part of this structure is something French parents call the mandatory taste. Children aren't required to finish what's on their plate. They aren't even required to like it, but they are expected to taste it. One polite taste. That's it. The language around this matters more than I expected. It's not framed as obedience or achievement. It's framed as learning. You don't have to like it. You do have to taste it so your tongue can learn. That single sentence shifted the entire tone of our meals. It removed judgment and replaced it with curiosity. At first, tasting felt like a hurdle. There was hesitation, sometimes dramatic reactions. And this is where the third element quietly supports everything else: how we respond in that moment. Instead of praise or disappointment, the focus moves to sensory exploration. Is it crunchy or soft? Does it taste salty or sweet? What does it remind you of? Those questions do something powerful. They redirect attention away from whether the food is accepted and toward what the experience actually is. Eating stops being a performance. It becomes information gathering. For a child who feels unsure, even smelling the food or touching it to their lips counts as exposure. There is no pressure to swallow, no commentary on faces made or bites taken. What I didn't realize before is how many exposures children need before a food feels safe. Research suggests anywhere from 8 to 15. Most of us give up far earlier, assuming refusal means final judgment. This framework treats refusal as part of the learning curve instead of a failure. But none of this works consistently without the final invisible pillar: the hunger window. French children don't graze throughout the afternoon. They have structured meals and a predictable snack, usually earlier in the day. After that, there is a pause. Water is available, but food is not. This was the hardest adjustment for me. Allowing space between eating moments felt counterintuitive. But once I understood hunger as a biological ally instead of something to fear, it made sense. Mild hunger sharpens attention. It increases willingness. It gives the body a reason to engage. Without that window, the rest of the structure collapses. A child who arrives at the table comfortably full has no internal motivation to taste unfamiliar foods, no matter how calm the environment is. When I put all three pieces together, something remarkable happened. Meals became quieter. Not because my child suddenly loved vegetables, but because the power struggle was gone. I wasn't chasing. They weren't resisting. We were each doing our part. This wasn't a trick. It was a system that respected how children are wired. And for the first time, dinner stopped feeling like a test of my parenting and started feeling like a shared, predictable moment again. Once the structure was in play and the power struggle faded, what followed wasn't a dramatic transformation, but something far more meaningful: a slow, steady shift in the emotional climate around food. The first few days were uncomfortable. I won't pretend otherwise. My child tested the new boundaries, not out of malice, but out of uncertainty. They ate less, sometimes barely anything, and every instinct in me wanted to intervene, to fix, to rescue. I had to sit with my own anxiety and remind myself that this discomfort wasn't harm. It was adjustment. What surprised me was how quickly the body responded once the rules stayed consistent. When snacks stopped filling every quiet moment between meals, hunger began to show up naturally, not desperation, just a gentle pull toward the table. Meals became calmer, not because my child suddenly liked everything, but because the urgency and tension were gone. By the end of the first week, something subtle changed. My child stopped scanning the kitchen for alternatives. They stopped asking what else there was. The meal in front of them became the meal, not a suggestion. And without the constant negotiation, they seemed more relaxed, more present. Over the following weeks, I noticed curiosity returning. A second taste here, a comment about texture there. Foods that were once rejected outright became familiar, then neutral, and occasionally even enjoyed. There was no celebration, no pressure to acknowledge progress. It simply unfolded. What mattered most was what didn't happen anymore. I wasn't counting bites. I wasn't narrating intake. I wasn't tying food to praise, rewards, or disappointment. Eating stopped being a measure of success or failure. It became a normal part of the day, predictable and emotionally safe. I also learned to trust something I had underestimated before: the child's body. Healthy children are remarkably capable of regulating themselves when the environment supports them. When hunger is allowed to exist and food is reliably offered, they eat. Not always what we hope. Not always as much as we imagine they should. But enough. And on the rare occasions when my child chose not to eat much at all, I held the boundary calmly. The next meal arrived at the next scheduled time. No emergency snacks, no lectures. Just consistency. Those moments taught me that one missed meal doesn't undo a child's well-being, but a chaotic feeding system can undo their trust. Over time, my role changed. I stopped seeing myself as someone who needed to convince or correct. I became the keeper of structure, the one who made sure meals were predictable, calm, and free of pressure. That alone did more than any strategy I had tried before. This approach didn't just change how my child ate, it changed how I felt as a parent. Mealtimes no longer felt like a referendum on my competence or care. They became what they were always meant to be: a shared pause in the day. If this way of thinking has unsettled you, even slightly, that's not a bad thing. It means you're starting to see beyond behavior and into the conditions shaping it. And often the most important changes don't happen at the table at all, but in the quiet hours between meals, where appetite is either built or quietly lost. Here's what all of this comes down to. Picky eating isn't a flaw in your child, and it isn't a failure in you. It's often the natural result of a system that unintentionally works against a child's biology and need for autonomy. When we stop trying to control eating and instead create calm, predictable conditions, children don't need to be convinced. Their bodies do the work for them. Structure replaces struggle. Curiosity replaces resistance. And meals slowly return to what they were meant to be: safe, ordinary, and shared. The deeper lesson is this: many challenges in life don't require more pressure or effort, but better conditions. Whether it's parenting, work, or relationships, forcing outcomes often backfires. When we focus on structure, timing, and respect for human needs, change becomes sustainable. In daily life, this means asking less, "How do I make this happen?" and more, "What environment would allow this to happen naturally?" Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. What is one thing about mealtimes, or parenting in general, that this perspective made you rethink? Share your thoughts in the comments so others can learn from your experience too. If this content resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations going and gives us the motivation to create more thoughtful, helpful content like this.